Do you ever love a game from beginning to end, but when asked why, come up completely blank? Like you can't actually describe what exactly it was about the game that was so good, only that you thought it was amazing. It's amongst the most infuriating experiences, a complete and foundational failure to communicate, an inability to share what you've experienced with even your closest friends. You know that there must be something interesting to be said, but where are the ideas to express it? This feeling is in a sense the entire point of analysis, of channels like this, to retroactively understand why we like what we like, and why certain things make us feel a certain way, positive or negative. Of course, the problem with these analyses is an ever-present temptation to overstate the case, a feeling that there must be grand, concrete answers to explain the way we feel. After all, if something had a profound effect on us, there just has to be a profound explanation as to why. Otherwise, every new game or YouTube video would make us cheer and cry after only a glance. This desire is, in its worst form, the manifestation of a very particular kind of insecurity. The idea that if something so puerile and stupid were to resonate with us, it would make us equally as childish. Big emotions ought to be reserved for complex, mature things. When I played Ori and the Blind Forest, I had an alright time with it. The platforming was fun, some of the abilities were interesting, and I definitely enjoyed the art style. It was a thoroughly well-rounded experience. I was utterly unprepared then for Ori and the Will of the Wisps, a game which hooked me in from the first cutscene and never let up. I wouldn't call Wisps a particularly good game. Instead, I'd more likely call it one of the best games to come out in the past 4 or 5 years. The problem is, I couldn't give a good reason as to why that is. Will of the Wisps is exactly what it says on the tin. It tells a mostly straightforward story, relying on tried and true themes, with fairly well-trodden archetypes, taking you mostly through standard video game biomes with an assortment of familiar abilities and encounters. I can't say that Will of the Wisps is an especially profound game, and this video will present little to no profound revelations in this regard. What I will try to say, however, is that Wisps executes on these ideas in a truly impressive way, a game that pulls at the heart so often and so precisely it would border on emotional manipulation if it didn't work so well. It's a game that lives and breathes on strong emotions. By far the Ori duology's biggest claim to fame is the presentation of its environments, impossibly detailed landscapes with intricate backgrounds featuring dynamic lighting and atmospheres. The results speak for themselves, and they speak pretty loudly. Just about any screenshot from Wisps could make for a perfect poster or animated wallpaper. The game makes this clear up front. The opening sequence is an especially impressive montage, the seasons and times of day seamlessly changing as you move across Swallow's Nest. The scene was so technical and precise in its timing, one developer claimed making it stretched almost over the whole production. Ori and the Will of the Wisps begins with a simple premise. Ori and newly adopted owl Ku decide to take a 3-hour tour across the ocean. Inevitably, their trip is interrupted by a storm, causing the pair to crash land into the unfamiliar land of Niwen, a forest dying from a prolonged decay as a consequence of the death of the spirit willow at the forest's center. As the only spirit left in Niwen, it eventually falls to Ori to retrieve the fragmented spirit lights and restore life back to the region. The story lends itself very well to highlighting the quirks and moody details of the setting. In the best example to show why even the most cliched tropes are still utilized, Wisps pulls off its dark and stormy prologue masterfully. Separated from Ku, an isolated Ori finds himself battered by quick winds under a torrential downpour. Flickers of light against the dark blues of the Inkwater Marsh offer only a brief reprieve before Ori is ambushed by a giant wolf. The next day, after the storm clears, the marsh is painted with a golden light, an empty water wheel looming far in the distance, overtaken by moss and algae. This kind of tone setting is not an isolated incident for the game. If anything, it is Wisp's modus operandi. The context of suffering from decay offers great leverage in allowing each area of Niwen to be contextualized by how the decay has affected it. Qualox Hollow and the wellspring are flooded with poisonous waters due to a decayed creature seizing up the wellspring at the top. Silent Woods, the epicenter of the decay, is bathed in dark grays, bones, and tar, a petrified husk of a once great forest. On the other hand, Luma Pools is a vibrant, overly saturated paradise, the one zone in Niwen that has thus far managed to escape the ill effects of the decay. Ori and the Will of the Wisps is not just one of the best looking games around, it's also one of the best in using its environmental cues to set the stakes of the journey at record speeds. It is to Wisps' credit that the game could probably remove 90% of its dialogue, and what is being conveyed would remain crystal clear. Not that the game is overly burdened with dialogue as is. Arguably, Wisps realizes its restoration of Niwen in more clever ways than Blind Forest did with Nibel. Blind Forest similarly had us trek across a forest to restore various aspects of life, whether that be the waters of the Jinzo tree or the absent winds in the valley, but Wisps takes a more metaphorical approach. We're sent to Bar's Reach in the latter half of the adventure, an eternally frigid region in Niwen's north, to retrieve the memory of the forest. The place where the memory is being held is a singular blossom tree at the peak of the Reach, representing the approaching spring that has not yet been allowed to pass. As the art book for the game suggests, the Reach cannot change winter into spring because the forest no longer has any memory of the seasons. Similarly, we're sent to the Moldwood Depths to retrieve the Eyes of the Forest, a giant cavern layered in twitching cicada carcasses, cordyceps lining the walls, and half-decayed wings splayed out in the foreground. The area is pitch black because Niwen has lost its eyes, a quite literal blind forest. Ironically, despite Niwen suffering from an extensive decay, this context helps to make the forest feel far more like a living organism than Nibel ever did. But it's not the only way Wisps gives Niwen more life. Wisps also gives its forest more character by giving its forest more characters. You'll frequently meet travelers throughout Niwen, all looking after their own little side projects. Ophir seeks to find the library atop the wellspring, Twillin seeks to collect as many spirit shards as possible, while Talk is a traveler seeking out the hidden nooks and secrets of the forest. And of course there are the Moki, a lemur-like race that preside over almost every location of Niwen. This is a considerable change from Blind Forest. Aside from the major players, Blind Forest featured no characters whatsoever wandering around its overworld. There was never the sense that anyone lived in places like Valley of the Wind or the Sunken Glades. On some level, this difference is fitting. Blind Forest was a game in which it was in some sense too late. By the time Ori encounters the Forlorn Ruins, the Gumo, the race that once lived there, are long since gone, and basically every single character in Blind Forest is motivated by such a loss already having taken place. Meanwhile, Will of the Wisps sees Niwen as being on the precipice. The Gumo equivalent, the Gorleks, are not completely wiped out yet, but they will be soon as the corruption takes hold of the last of their kind. Qualok, who protects the Moki, dies about halfway through the adventure, and the fate of Ku remains undecided for virtually the entire game. In Will of the Wisps, Niwen's destruction feels like a slow, unfurling process, preventable only should there exist the willpower to expel it. In the Wellspring Glades, the nearby Gorlek begins a project to construct a new community for the Moki, after the decay drove them out of the Silent Woods. One side quest sees a Moki ask Ori to build a new house for him and his family. Once completed, the Moki asks if Ori could tell his family to migrate to the Glades now that there's a safe place to live. But a trip to the Moki's old house uncovers only 2 stone statues left behind, petrified life from the decay. Recounting what has happened to the Moki, he can only say, "I must go home," completing the side quest and giving Ori his reward. What the game doesn't tell you is that paying a second visit to the old home now reveals a third statue, a family now forever locked in time. Perhaps the one element that makes the environments of Niwen pop most, beyond the scenery itself, is Gareth Coker's fantastic score for the game. The most satisfying part is how the music alters and evolves as you progress through each zone. In areas like the windswept wastes, the music changes once you gain the ability to burrow underneath the sand. It's a trick the game employs in several areas, symbolizing greater mastery of the place you're currently progressing through. In other instances, the music changes to reflect the events of the story. Luma Pools plays the same theme throughout your initial journey through the area, but after the foul presence is defeated, killing Qualock as a result. The Luma Pools theme is changed to the aptly titled Resolution in Paradise. These simplistic flourishes are yet another way in which Wisps provokes emotions, offering a tangible sense in which your actions have changed and healed the forest around you. My favorite piece of music in the game, a song titled Ash and Bone, plays after finding Ku in the Silent Woods, while Kuro's feather, the pair's ticket to fly back home, continuously evades their grasp. The giant shriek lurches and screams in the background as we wind around half-broken logs. The piece acts as a slow build-up, a sense of urgency as you trespass into Shriek's domain. She demands silence in her woods, and you are now disrupting that perfect order. So it's pretty clear that Will of the Wisps is invested in painting its environments as vividly as possible. But to what end? What is this focus on the environment really in service of? It is to emphasize the power that Ori wields over the fate of Niwen. Will of the Wisps' story is one of responsibility and redemption. The idea that Ori, despite never having been to Niwen, has an undeniable and inextricable duty to repair the broken forest. Ki, a character hovering over a dead tree in the Silent Woods, makes the argument very pointedly. Your kind is not welcome here in my garden. When the trees needed you most, yes, you were gone. Now look, look! My garden is all but dead, see? Cold stone, bitter dust. Leave this dying place, yes, as your kind did before, unless you can bring my last daughter healing. Right what your kind has wronged. Similarly, a dying Qualock leaves a message for Ori about the future of the Moki. Watch over them for me. Watch over this land. You may be the only one who can. Talk later puts Qualock's words more plainly. He gave us hope that we could stop the decay, or at least slow it. Now, that hope's with you and the Wisps. Qualock and Talk both emphasize that only Ori can properly take up the mantle that Qualock had provided for so long. In the Ori games, the power of the light and the spirits seems to be a more agnostic and ambivalent force than an outright benevolent one. In Blind Forest, the light of the spirit tree only allows for certain kinds of beings to exist within Nibel, inadvertently killing off Kuro's children in a wave of light which ultimately kickstarts the events of that game. Will of the Wisps then acts as a prolonged atonement for that wrong. After Kuro sacrifices herself to restore the spirit tree at the end of Blind Forest, Ku, the only surviving child of Kuro's after the wave, is taken in by Ori's family and given a life of her own. Ori even gives Ku the last of Kuro's feathers, allowing her to fly despite her damaged wing. But when Ku becomes lost in Niwen in the prologue, it jeopardizes the very core of Kuro's sacrifice. Should Ori fail to find Ku, the last piece of Kuro's legacy will be lost forever. It's not just Ku at stake, but also the remnants of the lives the light left behind. In a similar fashion, Ori must act as a representative for the light of Niwen, and atone for the devastation it wrought when the spirit willow shattered, bringing the onset of the decay. At the end of the game, Ori chooses to cast off his spirit form and become the sprout that will eventually grow into Niwen's next spirit tree. The game heavily foreshadows this decision. The narrator, who sounds exactly like the spirit tree from Blind Forest, curiously refers to events in Wisps by saying things like, "Our story began," as if the spirit tree itself had managed to move to a completely different continent. Of course, the ending reveals the truth. The narrator was not in fact the same as in Blind Forest, but Ori in the far future, now a fully grown spirit tree. With all of this in mind, it becomes a lot more clear why Wisps chooses to make the environments of Niwen its greatest and most well-developed character. Ori's sacrifice hinges on building a strong connection with the land itself. Saving it feels important because watching the effects of the decay bleed out the last ounces of life in Niwen is legitimately tragic to watch. At the center of the Silent Woods is an owl graveyard, a mass of decomposed and petrified bones. But the horror those stone owls represent is more than theoretical. Shriek, born from this graveyard, is the decay personified, herself having a petrified exterior. Shriek is the light's greatest failure, a life utterly neglected and unprotected. Notably, Ori attempts to correct this wrong too, but the damage is already done. Shriek rejects Ori's grace without hesitation. It is a dark mirror of Ku, a sign of what might come should Ori fail to save her and fail to take responsibility over Niwen. There's one last, and pretty obvious way in which Will of the Wisps emphasizes the environment, the very responsive gameplay. Wisps isn't really doing anything that novel here. Rather, it relies heavily on the greatest strength of its larger genre. Metroidvanias, as they're often called, work first and foremost because of their fairly unique form of progression. Many have spoken about the staple feature of the genre being the ability to use newly acquired skills to reach different parts of previously explored zones. And while this is certainly true, the strength of this approach is much more extensive than that. In typical Metroidvanias, the worlds you first enter into often feel hostile and unforgiving, labyrinth mazes with no coherent sense of where you are. I've already talked about how Wisps does this part brilliantly with Inkwater Marsh. Furthermore, rather than one relatively stable moveset, Metroidvanias begin with a very impoverished offering of abilities. Moving the characters can often feel clunky and limiting, and these two features may explain why Metroidvanias can often feel like a bit of a slog at the beginning. If there was ever a time you're gonna get lost or confused in one of these games, it's almost certainly at the beginning, and games of this genre rarely offer their best gameplay at the beginning of the adventure. However, these choices are far from a limitation of the genre. They are, if anything, their main appeal. While the beginning of the game may feel clumsy, by the end, you've not only managed to build a literal and mental map of the once intimidating landscape, your ability to traverse that space has also expanded rapidly, allowing you to prove your mastery over once difficult platforming. One of the most satisfying feelings in any Metroidvania is swooping and gliding around places you previously had to explore on foot in over double the time. And this strength applies just as much to the Ori games as it does to other giants of the genre, like Hollow Knight. If anything, Will of the Wisps is a far more traditional Metroidvania than Blind Forest was. Blind Forest required a more methodical, attentive study of what you were going to do. Energy consumption was a near constant concern in the early game, what with some abilities requiring energy to use, the skill tree being gated behind a single point of energy, and doors which were gated by giving up a specified amount of energy. And there were only limited areas where you could even find new stores of energy, so it was important to conserve what you already had. Moreover, Ori was largely defenseless, relying on a small wisp to do almost all of the fighting in the game. Combat was best dealt with at a distance. Most interestingly though, Blind Forest was a game with virtually no checkpoints. You were left on your own to make them, wherever you wanted, by placing down soul links, using a bit of energy of course. These were fairly unique features of Blind Forest that made it stand out. In contrast, Will of the Wisps is more straightforward. It is far more versatile, with a revamped combat system, even allowing Ori to lug a giant spirit hammer around, and little resource management to worry about. There's quite literally an ability to restore health at the cost of a little bit of energy, which is much easier to find than in Blind Forest. Checkpoints are taken care of for you. On the surface, this may sound like a bad thing, like a flattening of some very novel ideas into something more safe and comfortable. And on some level, that's exactly what it is. But I also think it's important to point out that some of Blind Forest's more unique aspects were better ideas on paper than how they ended up turning out. In particular, the soul link was often a deeply frustrating mechanic. If you found yourself in a flow state playing the game, which is ideally what the gameplay of these games are designed to achieve, it was very easy to forget to place new soul links down. The result is that one small error can end up costing several minutes of progress. Because again, Blind Forest has very few save points otherwise. The result is this almost paranoid state where you're constantly thinking about where your last placed soul link was, and whether it's worth placing a new one after every platforming segment so you don't have to do it again if you die. Put simply, I'm not all that unhappy that Wisps decided to eject the system for the sake of simplicity. Even though the Ori games mostly rely on proven fundamentals of the genre, it would be wrong to suggest they offer nothing new to the formula. Once again, Ori, more so than other Metroidvanias, is really focused on testing your ability to navigate the environment in a fairly complex way. The bash ability is the most notable example, allowing you to treat basically any enemy or projectile as an object to propel yourself off of. It's hard to understate just how many options this opens up in terms of platforming. Chaining together multiple projectiles lets you travel higher than normal, and when you combine it with other movement abilities later in the game, Bash effectively allows you to treat the ground as more of a suggestion than a requirement. Willow's End, the game's final area, couldn't make the point better. A rotted out tree which features virtually no platforms to land on whatsoever. Together with the launch ability, which can be activated mid-jump, Willow's End essentially has you floating in the air for the entire area. Ditto for the final boss, where the ground breaks apart and you're forced to confront Shriek's final phase in a continuous fall. This floatiness isn't entirely unique to Wisps though. Blind Forest's Mount Horu was designed in a very similar way as well. This gets at the unique appeal of the Ori games over other Metroidvanias. Abilities like the bash and launch and grapple make for extremely fluid movement, providing a way to demonstrate your mastery of the environment in a very visceral manner. Enemies in the Ori games are not so much obstacles for beating up as they are tools to aid in your elaborate sequence of movements. It's fitting then that the Ori games' biggest set-piece moments are for the most part not traditional boss fights, but extended escape sequences, a much more meaningful way to test your grasp over Ori's moveset than any regular boss fight could. In Blind Forest, this rule was absolute. The game had 0 bosses whatsoever. Will of the Wisps, as before, is a little more standard, but its boss roster is extremely small compared to other games in the genre. Indeed, some areas still choose to forego bosses entirely in favor of chase sequences, such as in the Wellspring Glades, Bar's Reach, or the Wind-Torn Ruins. And even when there is a boss, the game still ensures to include these sequences, with all but a single boss featuring a built-in chase that either precedes the fight or occurs during a phase change. The Ori games are quite insistent that your platforming skills be tested wherever they can be. We could talk all day about the story and the environments and the interplay between the various mechanics, but the only thing that discussion would really tell us is that Will of the Wisps is a well-made game. I think that's pretty obvious. But none of it seems to get at the fundamental question I'm trying to answer. Why is Will of the Wisps such a special game? I'm reminded of when I played Final Fantasy XVI last year. I knew the minute I saw those giant icon fights I had to make a video about it. It was some of the most exhilarating stuff I'd ever seen. But what was really special about them? Why did they leave such an impression on me months after putting the game down? The answer I came up with at the end of that video was astoundingly simple. They were just kind of absurd. The sheer level of detail and attention pouring out of every corner of these sometimes over half-hour encounters is the kind of thing that a wordy description can never adequately capture. It's the kind of thing that's so preposterous, you can't really grasp the scale of what's being discussed until you've sat down and experienced it for yourself. I will make a similar appeal for Will of the Wisps. Just look at this game. Every screen is like moving through a painting, seamlessly swinging from one art gallery exhibit to the next. Have you really seen anything else like it? I can't say I have. So after bloviating for 20 minutes or so, I'm forced to conclude that the reason why Will of the Wisps is so special is that it is an extremely evocative video game. Evocative not in an irreverent or shocking kind of way, but more a sort of trance-like hypnotism. A kaleidoscope of colors and emotions. It's hard not to get bought in so completely to what the game is doing, no matter how obvious and trite it may seem. Will of the Wisps is evocative in the sense that it's the kind of game that sends shivers down your spine when you perfectly execute that one jump, or the music swells in that one really tense boss fight. This, I suppose, is the whole frustration. How can I possibly convey such an experience in words? The sad answer for YouTubers like me is that I can't, no matter how hard I try. You just have to play it for yourself.